Hello, folks. This is Chuck. Hello. Welcome back. This is Fire Theft Radio. And like I said, man, Omar's not here today, but we got a good episode for you. Why don't you give our guest a proper introduction? Go for it, bro.
Yeah. I may not be in studio, but I'm right here, dude. So on today's episode, we have Dr. Judd Burton. He has a website called burtonbeyond.com. That's burtonbeyond.com. And there you will find all his information. He has many various degrees in various subjects, such as theology, such as religion, and he has lots of archaeological experiences. And so, we just wanted to have him on today because it's kind of like we were going to have Dr. Judd Burton on maybe 2 years ago, but then something happened during Halloween because we want to talk about that because he has a lot of interesting knowledge on mythology and context, more importantly, and how all these things flow together, like legend, mythology, and how that just how we understand it today. And we were going to have him on for that, and something happened. Emails got crossed within the internet streams, and then time went by, and then finally we have him on today. So, we're really happy. We're very blessed to have on Dr. Judd Burton. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Indeed. So, hey, you just accepted my friend request. Thank you for that. I feel special on, you you accepted it on Facebook. I saw some of your posts, man. I saw you playing, slapping the bass, man. You're a little bass slapper?
I play a number of instruments. Guitar was my main instrument for a long time. I thought that's what I was going to do for a living. But, that semester I was filling in as a bass player for the stage band at the college I was at. Really?
Wow. Well, look at that. I play a little guitar and keyboard myself.
Right on.
Yeah. So it's something that's near and dear to my heart. I saw that and I was like, oh, cool, man. Yeah. Like getting the music on. That's what's up. And, like Omar said,
I can clap my hands together.
That's musical. It's percussive.
He plays a pretty mean triangle,
I do.
Yeah. But no, like Omar was saying, we had you back on. I think there's just some stuff happened. We couldn't get you on, and then this is years in the making. We finally got you on, and we're pretty excited, man. Thanks for coming on.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, getting right into it, Omar, what do you want to talk about? Because we have like all these things that we want to talk about. I'm like, dude, he knows so much about all these things. Where do we start? Because if we concentrate on one topic, we got hours worth of content on just that topic in and of itself. You know what I mean? So you tell me, Omar, where do you want to launch this? Ask the questions. He's here. He's ready to go.
I know. Finally, he's here. I know. I've been listening to you, Judd. How do you want me to call you? Dr. Judd Burton.
Judd's fine.
Judd, all right, cool, Judd. I've been following you personally for many, many years. The first time I ever heard about you was on Rob Skiba's show, and then on Canary Cry Radio, and this was maybe like 6 years ago. Yeah, this was maybe like 6 years ago when I personally myself just started discovering about mythology, because I grew up in the church, just kind of like it was just kind of like mainstream. Nothing too well. I mean, it was weird, but nothing too weird. They never dealt into the lore, mythology. Never read the Bible within its context. And then when I finally grew up and I started reading about it,
I think the reason our church was weird because everything was out of context, and it was just
exactly.
It's just weirdness going on,
out of context, yeah. And then when we started reading into context, that's when a lot of your teachings and a lot of your books started falling in line into the biblical context, and to me that was really amazing. So I guess my first question would be like, what led you? Because we always like to find out like what led you, the authors, the podcasters, the people who have this knowledge. What led you into discovering or looking into these kind of things?
Well, of course, at the top of the list is God.
Right on.
I'm a scholar, but it's married to my faith. I look at a lot of strange stuff, obviously, but I do that through the lens of both faith and reason. And so it's been a calling on my life for sure. But of course, God has used people and mentors, starting from my my mom and dad, we always had a lot of reading material around. The Sunday school teachers that I had.
Yeah. They're sparking interest in you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you say, I grew up in the church too. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. You typically don't get too many Sunday school lessons about the mythological context of, things like the Genesis 6 event or any of the giant tribes or anything like that. And so I always wondered about, possibilities there. But, history in the past and biblical history in particular has always been an interest to me. And long before I knew who Indiana Jones was, the brother-in-law of our pastor at our church when I was a kid taught New Testament and Greek and was also an archaeologist at a local university. And he would come over and do the Bible studies, like specialized Bible studies. And I loved them. And I was in a room full of adults, and there was like this, 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid, mouth agape, listening to, and I would just completely pick his brain, after the lessons were over.
Right.
And so he sort of took me under his arm, and that was the late Dr. George Knight, and very erudite, very learned and humble guy. And he took me into a session, basically a kids class for archaeology they did at this university one summer. And I later would study Greek with him at the same university. I spent 3 years studying New Testament Greek. And at the end of my bachelor's degree period, he suggested that I go on an archaeological expedition. But it wasn't just to any old place. It was to this place at the foot of Mount Hermon, which in the Bible is called Caesarea Philippi. The modern name is Bonias. And it was a matrix level rabbit trail. I went there just to learn the scientific rudiments of archaeology. It turned out to be quite a bit more revelatory than just simply turning, dirt over with a trowel.
Right.
Particularly when I became, familiar with the apocryphal literature and the biblical passages associated with that region and the Genesis 6 event. But Dr. George Knight was very, very influential in getting me going that way and thinking about some things in different ways. And, he was one of the first academic Bible teachers that I had who talked about the Bible and mythology. I can remember a session in class one time when we were translating portions of the Book of Revelation. Not exactly light work.
Yeah.
But he's talking. John's using all of this imagery, yes, because he sees it in this vision, but a lot of it is in the mythological language that people would have understood in the day, and that was a revelation, for me, or maybe just a further confirmation of things that I knew deep down. But I've had a number of good teachers, but Dr. Knight was really at the center of moving me along the way in terms of teachers that were directly involved. I had great history professors like Dr. Don Taylor at Hardin-Simmons, and I would later study at Texas Tech under Dr. John Howe, who is a fantastic historian of religion, medieval Christian historian. But the other side of this is that it's been a lot of this is self-education. In other words, especially for the stranger stuff that sort of hovers on the fringes of accepted academia and scholarship, you have to do quite a bit of self-education and reading on this stuff outside. So,
do you think that's one of the reasons that it escapes a lot of modern day evangelical churches? Like here personally, I go to a Calvary Chapel, and I mean, if I bring something like this up, it's kind of like, yeah, save that maybe for like a youth group discussion. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. but at best, it's really not part or really made relevant. And I'm assuming it's probably because of something like this.
Well, my buddy Dr. Michael Heiser has a saying: if it's weird and it's in the Bible, it's probably important.
Yeah. I completely agree. I kind of it's interesting because this show, I mean, obviously it's touched on so many weird subjects. We've had Heiser on talking about his books Unseen Realm and Reversing Hermon.
Yeah.
And
stuff.
Yeah, indeed. And we've had Gary Wayne come on, and he was talking about his book and just the lineages and all that stuff and the giants and a lot of weird taboo things. And honestly, the stuff that's caused more of a controversy, of a ruckus, always is Heiser's work,
Yeah.
And they instantly, I get so much hate DMs from people or from Facebook messages like, how dare you, I am ruining people, like Christians' walk and all, because I'm talking about giants or biblical cosmology.
Well, I mean, he said something really funny at the last conference that the Institute of Biblical Anthropology did, before all the COVID mess. He said, none of this stuff is salvific, really.
Right.
In terms of theology, the Watchers and the Giants and things like that. It's not directly salvific. And, the Great Commission does not say, go forth and slay Nephilim.
Right. That'd be a tough act to follow.
Yeah, we needed to put that on a T-shirt or something. But
that is a T-shirt.
But it's still a relevant part of the narrative.
Yes.
Pops, I like what Steve Coyle says about it. It's in many ways it's like a Rosetta Stone to the Bible. It makes a lot of obscure passages come into focus. And, Mike and myself and other people who deal with this stuff in the original languages and the archaeological and historical context, we're basically just letting the text say what it says, and doing that in the context, the cultural context in which it was written. In other words, if you, like, one of the first historical crimes that I was ever taught about was, one of the things you never do as a historian is completely project, your cultural norms onto people from another time. In this case, in the ancient world, because I mean, not that there aren't some moral and ethical things that you could, but if you do that completely, then you almost totally erode the context that's necessary for understanding those texts. And for instance, at the heart of this issue is the Benach Elohim, for instance, the sons of God referenced in Genesis 6, who would be the Watchers or Egregori and the apocryphal stuff, and the Apkallu would be the Mesopotamian equivalent. There's really no other way that you can look at that logically and say that it means anything other than an angelic being. Because any other time that it's used in the Old Testament text, that's what it means. It doesn't mean human. It doesn't mean the descendants of Seth, which is the popular idea that's taught in virtually all seminaries today, much to the chagrin of myself and my peers, because it's just flat out wrong. You're brutalizing that phrase to make it fit your theology. Well, that's not how it works. Your theology is supposed to emanate from the text.
Mm.
You know, it's always better when you're looking at this stuff in text, and that's why people, some people think that we, maybe we come across as smug about it. We're just being matter of fact that this is what it says. We're letting the language do the talking. We're not projecting onto it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No,
we become too smart for our own good, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and
we get set in our ways. We get taught one way for years. I'm guilty of that too.
Yeah, for sure.
But the more, read the Bible, read the Bible, read the Bible, study the Bible. That's what we're trying to do. Mike's got this. It's what he's done for years. He's doing it through the Awakening School now. I've got my institute. That's what we're trying to get people to do is go, look at the context, let us help you, short of building a time machine and going back there, immersing yourself to a point in this culture so that you can understand what the Bible is talking about, what the authors are talking about.
Now, archaeologically, and you said you went to Hermon, to the base of Hermon, did you find that evidence that kind of fits to the historical accurate perspective of the Bible? Is that why it was a rabbit hole, or what exactly did you find there? What was your red pill moment where you're like, whoa,
Well, it had less to do with the project that we were directly working on. We were actually excavating Herod Agrippa II's palace there at Bonius. But of course, as we were there, we had time to, we were on break or whatever on the weekends. We had all kinds of tours, and we could walk around in the park and view all the other ruins. It was only as I understood the significance, not only in the context of Jesus' visit there, but also in the context of the Jewish Apocrypha. A lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls material. And begin to really look into that I'm like, so a lot of that was after I actually came back from that first expedition. And I was like, this is incredible. This event, happened here. And I was at ground zero.
That's a weird feeling. That's gotta be a weird feeling,
Yeah, it was, I just started to peel back that onion, a couple of months before we left. I gotten some copies of Enoch and the Genesis Apocryphon and the Book of Giants, what fragments we have of that, and a couple of other texts. And it was really kind of mind-blowing. Just every day working in the shadow of that mountain and knowing that the shrine to the shepherd god Pan, that the city was originally named after, was likely another identity for one of the chiefs of these watcher angels, in particular Azazel.
Mm-hmm. Which is Pan is horned, correct?
Yes, and Azazel, of course, is the first association most people make is with the atonement sacrifice, the Azazel goat that's mentioned in Leviticus. Right. But you start breaking down his name, and it, that morpheme at the beginning of his name, Oz, means goat. His name literally means goat of God. And I've done a number. In fact, I've got chapters in my books, Peneus. In Peneus, I deal with that. There's a chapter called "The Many Faces of Pan" that deal directly with the linkage of identities, the mythological identities over the years in this particular, what scholastically you would call sacred space. The creation of a shrine area.
Do you mind going into a little bit into that, just the context of why it was this so significant, why Mount Hermon is so specifically there, and Pan and Azazel. For some of our listeners who don't understand, who have not heard it before, Chuck and myself we're very well versed in this, but we always get new listeners coming on, and so
yeah, and
so
then
we can
that
lead them down the rabbit hole.
That, and then what I was going to ask about sharing with us some of the identities that this Azazel Pan has taken, that people might kind of even realize it. They're still, I don't know. I mean, I see it seeped into our modern day culture, even our movies, like Pan's Labyrinth, you know what I mean? And I mean, I'd love for you to connect kind of like the mythology of Hollywood into the, I guess, the anthropology of these specific characters,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on a popular level, we're just sort of bombarded, with that kind of imagery from movies and TV and things like that. But getting back to, most people will be familiar with Genesis chapter 6, the verse about the sons of God coming down and taking wives from the daughters of men. And of course, their progeny were these giants, the Nephilim. And you really get kind of a snapshot of that in Genesis, but the apocryphal material, which isn't part of the canon, but is still theologically and historically, culturally relevant, really sort of breaks open and expounds on what's happening here. And it names Mount Hermon as the place where these 200 fallen angels came to the earth and began this sort of Genesis 6 experiment, as it's often called. But the way that this sort of all came together for me is when I began looking at this site, Paneas, that became Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament era. When I began looking at Jesus's visit to this region, and it's just a few verses in Matthew chapter 16, Mark chapter 8, and then you get a little bit in Luke chapter 9, although it's not, I think it's chapter 9, it's not referenced by name. But this would seem just to be sort of a stop out, on Jesus's ministry. John the Baptist had just been beheaded. It's right outside the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. But Jesus chooses this place to establish the church and to also make a public admission, at least amongst his immediate followers, of his messiahship. And he does it against this backdrop in this Greco-Roman capital of the north. You've got Mount Hermon there. All of his disciples would have known. Anybody with a Jewish background in earshot would have known. It's likely that the local peoples there, whether they were the Greco-Roman citizens living there, or the Etrurians that were native to the region, or anybody else, Aramaeans, Galileans, would have been familiar with those traditions, because by this time they're centuries, if not millennia, ensconced in that part of the world. You've got Batanea to the east, which was the Latinized version of Bashan, and some people will remember that the giant king Og ruled over Bashan. Mm-hmm. The apostate tribe of Dan had land directly to the west of this region, and of course the entire Golan carries the imprint, the legacy of the giants, with monuments like the Gilgal Rephaim, and also the Serpent Mound that Doug Van Dorn recently discovered.
So basically, it was like the center for all evil is where Jesus decided, I'm going to start my church here.
Exactly. And, Jesus is also very careful about the word. It's very, the words and phrases he uses in this episode are very important. When he says that the gates of hell will not prevail against this, that region in Ugaritic literature had been known as the gates of hell. Mm-hmm. when he uses the Greek word is ekklesia for church, but it means assembly, and it does harken back to like the Athenian the assemblies of the democratic city-states in ancient Greece, but it also harkens back to the Olympian assembly. So, which is basically another identity for, the Watchers and these early generations of giants.
And the council.
And so Jesus is literally saying, your time, he's firing a shot over the bow, but by using the word ekklesia, assembly, he's also saying, you guys have really screwed up. This false celestial assembly, I'm knocking over and replacing it with my assembly. And Mike Heiser, he talks about a lot of this kind of stuff too, and we sort of arrived at a lot of the same conclusions, just by engaging with the material. But it's very clear that this is a very significant portion, of Jesus's ministry that gets overlooked often because, again, this context is not taught in seminaries.
Right, because you kind of get the whole, he's here to give us salvation, and of course that's the most important thing that he's doing with his people, but that is but the beginning of what it means. And when I'm allowed to teach over here from time to time, I try to get the idea that that's just the beginning of what it means of him starting the restoration of everything. You know what I mean? And
exactly. And like reversing Hermon, where Mike's talking about, Jesus is taking back the title sons of God, from these people who or not people, but beings that had wrested the title, and that's part and parcel for, the Watchers and the Nephilim. But as to your other part of the question, the identities of Pan, I think this is very important too, because there were, if you backtrack a little bit into the Bronze Age, there were other goat deities in the region whose names were even phonetically similar to Azazel. There were Ods and Uds, the Babylonian Amorite Adzaga. You had Benu, who was another Mesopotamian goat deity. In fact, a few months ago, there was a discovery of an etching of Benu as part of a magical incantation. I cannot remember for the life of me. It was an Assyrian site, so this would have been a later Mesopotamian one. But his identity is as these different goat deities is scattered, throughout the that region and diffuses into other parts of the world as well. Even names like Benu, the Assyrian Benu, is phonetically similar to the word Pan, the name Pan in Greek. And you also have even titles for Pan, like the Aigepan. That first part of his name is a reference to the sea. There was a goat skin covered shield that he gave to Zeus called the Ix. So there's similarity between these prefixes like Ige and Ix and Odds that undoubtedly stem from the ancient Near East and diffused into other parts of the Mediterranean. So and even Azazel as Pan is if you look at the worship of Pan, not just at Banyas, but across the Greco-Roman world, Pan was a god of shepherds and goat herds. Well, in that sense, he's sort of the misleading herder, and it's a mockery of Jesus, who's the good shepherd. So there's another layer of meaning that you can add to Jesus' visit to Paneas, Caesarea Philippi. This is all extrapolated by digging into the context, digging into the languages. And unfortunately, we've sort of lost the art of expositing biblical teaching. And you don't even really have to have degrees in Hebrew or Greek or theology to do that. 2 generations ago, people were doing that just because they read the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it tells you a lot about how much people are not doing that,
Yeah.
Well, we've become very comfortable and trusting more than anything. Like, we've become very trustworthy, and it's not it's not like the pastors or these people at your church are doing it in a malicious way because they want to hide something from you. It's more out of like ignorance, unfortunately,
Yeah, that's very true. And to a point, like you say, there's usually not malicious intent behind that. It's just a matter of ignorance. And to a point, you don't want to fault them, but there's also the other side of that is how much do you hold them responsible because they're the head of a flock.
It's
that's a choice.
Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons I'm like, I can't. That's a lot of responsibility. Like, if goodness gracious, to be a leader of a flock, it is a lot of responsibility for sure.
Sure.
But one thing I wanted to say before I lose the thought, because people these days, especially now in the rise of like new age religions and things like that, they want to kind of discredit Jesus by saying that things that he was doing in the New Testament are actually just copies of older pagan deities, or just he's just a copy and those are older. So since those are older deities, Jesus must be not real, and it's just kind of like a copy that Christians did, and now we have Christianity. But when you were talking about the whole Jesus is the actual shepherd, Jesus wasn't copying that. He was putting the proper context back into the story of who it is,
That's exactly right. And I hear this over and over and over again, and I should say that I hardly ever hear a logical counter that's given to it. And it's really not that difficult. But, the criticism that's leveled against Jesus is that usually, he's another version of these solar deities that were born on the winter solstice.
Right.
They were supposed to have been born of a virgin. They resurrected. You could go. There's a laundry list of them you can go down through if you look at them in terms of like comparative mythology. So there's Mithras. In the Persian East. There's Osiris.
Dionysus.
Even element. Yeah, their bodies were also broken or destroyed for some greater good. Even other gods that show up in disparate places, like Odin. Odin was speared to the world ash. Supposedly to bring knowledge to humanity or whatever. Mm-hmm. But as for these older deities, where people, as the New Age community, as you say, you usually level this criticism about Jesus, is that Jesus is the only time that this takes place in completion in real time and space. In other words, these ideas about the virgin birth, about the redemption of humanity, about revealing a way out for humanity, of triumphing over evil, about your body being broken, about you resurrecting. In a way, we're sort of mythologically, God created us to be hardwired to want all that. Mm-hmm. So it's natural that Satan and his minions are going to manipulate that ideologically through cultures and time and space, so that you have all these other, archetypes, for lack of a better word. But, they're only bits and pieces, and Jesus is the only place where you have a historical context for that actually happening. So, again, I like what Mike Heiser says about, Jesus is the one true myth.
The myth that is true, yeah.
The myth that is true. That's right.
Yeah, and I mean to go along with that, I saw the movie and also the documentary, A Case for Christ, Lee Strobel's, and
oh yeah, fantastic book, fantastic movie.
Yes, indeed. And I think me and Omar towards the end we were like, "Oh man, I actually got emotional in the movie, man. It was good acting too." You know?
I told you, dude, it was gonna be good.
Yeah. But what I like about the film is that it presents a lot of the historical existence and how accurate the existence of Jesus, the one they call Christ, is next to any other deity that supposedly existed. You know what I mean? Like there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence, like an exponential ridiculous amount, you know?
Yeah, like we have more copies of the New Testament and the Old Testament, compiled. We have more copies of that than we have extant of either the Iliad or the Odyssey or Virgil's Aeneid, a lot of this classical literature. And, the New Testament, the Gospels and the Epistles should serve as historical documentation as well. They're eyewitness accounts in many cases. Going beyond that, you have, in particular, Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. And then you have, a couple of generations, or I should say one to two generations removed, you have other Roman authors who are writing about him too. Mm-hmm. Both Suetonius and notably Tacitus, both wrote about Jesus.
Yeah, it wasn't just Christian and Jewish people. It was people that were not even part of the religion, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's another thing a lot of people miss. It's funny I bring this up because I just had this conversation. I have this. We're here in Southern California and we're close to LA County, and LA County's pretty shut down. So a lot of barbershops are still doing business kind of like speakeasy style. You got to knock through the back door and all that stuff, and this whole thing. It's pretty crazy. So I got this guy that's cuts my hair, and I got to go. I have to call him. He has to open the back door and all that good stuff, but he's keeping his business afloat, and it's funny. There was a lot of people in there, and we were getting our hair cut, and it's interesting to me the conversations that we have today we would have never had 10 years ago, and the conversations were all about aliens, they were about giants and Nephilim, but they were speaking it from a context of like the New Age, like this different, but the conversation was so comfortable to them, like, oh yeah, and this, and they were talking about what people would consider conspiracies, but I was listening to them, and I'm thinking to myself immediately, like, if they only knew the context of the Bible, all of this is relevant, and all of this is part of that restoration. I'm like, man, you guys are part of the story. I wanted to really speak out, and then finally I didn't know where to start because there were so many topics, but one of the things that they asked is about giants and mythology and things like that. And I guess I wanted to ask you is, this is just such an open conversation to unbelievers alike now, where it's just quite easy to talk about things like this. But why do you think we have to this day this kind of obsession with mythology, with giants and vampires and werewolves and these things? We just every year there's a new mythological movie. Our superheroes, there's supernatural things. We just seem to have this connection to that. Like we just want to know more,
Right. Well, and what an opportunity, we have as believers to, the conversation's right there. They already want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if more people can understand the Bible in that context and quit treating myth like it's such a brutalized word in Western languages in particular. We use it as a synonym for a lie, or a fallacy, when it literally means, story in Greek. It usually is some sort of legendary or historical, often, or philosophical context. Why? The main reason is because at one point, in the history of humanity, we were all abundantly aware that the supernatural was real because people had experiences with the supernatural. And in, in many cases, you can trace the origins of some of these monsters, and folkloric creatures like vampires and werewolves and revenants and zombies. You can trace a lot of that back to the pre-flood experimentation. Because at the root, these creatures are demonic. Even if they're able to manipulate matter and appear, however they want to, at the root is demonic. And we shouldn't count things like that out because obviously the celestial beings that landed on Mount Hermon were manipulating matter in this reality. Which is, again, these are all things that we see popping up in movies now. And the high tech and the supernatural, the dividing line that we draw between that is sharply disappearing. Which is interesting because these ancient peoples, that I'm talking about all over the globe, knew that there was a supernatural reality, again, because they were experiencing it. It's only been within the last, 250, 300 years, that the reality of supernaturalism was considered a variable. The age of enlightenment, although it produced a lot of good things, the Enlightenment movement, it took empiricism and shaved away almost all virtue and value and reality of supernaturalism, to the point that the only value that it would have is in the context of art or cultural traditions or things like that. And this is a legacy that we live with now because, even scholars that deal with topics like, angelology or demonology or the giants or whatever, they typically treat it as fascinating and interesting on a scholastic level, but with no bearing in physical reality. But the overabundance of intersecting with the supernatural in the history and culture of the world, and this is something that anthropologists really sort of picked up on before historians did, the fact that it is a perennial should speak volumes about its existence. Otherwise, how many billions of people have been involved in a conspiracy to fool the rest of us about the supernatural? I mean, it's just logically absurd.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I didn't think about it in those terms, to put that into perspective.
And I think it's also one of the other modern problems is that I think going back to it is that we think we're too smart for ourselves. It's like,
especially nowadays.
The scientism leaks in. Whether you want to or not, we are all guilty of living in this Western world and having Western thoughts and having that whole logical process behind absolutely everything. There has to be a reason for it. There has to be a logic. And we live also partly in a world where we do go to church, when we do believe in Jesus, like we go and we listen to the pastor talk about Jesus walking on water, right?
Yeah.
Or the virgin birth.
Or the virgin birth. How truly do we believe that? Because if we really believed it, then all these other things, as Jesus saying that, I will build my, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, meaning literal gates of hell and demons and all these evil forces. I don't know. I think we just have this. It's our human brain that really
we don't extrapolate the supernatural, together, right? We kind of keep it confined to Jesus, but it goes beyond that, right? We keep the supernatural confined to Jesus, or even worse, we don't subscribe to supernatural. It mingling with the church itself, with us. You know what I mean? It's almost.
I think you're getting at the heart of the problem there. I heard one theologian say that we've turned Jesus into a life coach, and Christianity has become, a morally therapeutic deism.
Oh man, yeah. That's
Quite hard to argue with that.
It's the truth. It's one of the things I say often to the youth when I teach is don't look into the Bible for power verses. Like, stop looking for it to inspire yourself, which is not a bad thing,
Yeah.
But
Right.
But don't specifically think that's Bible study to memorize Joshua 1:9, like, be strong and courageous, be not afraid. Bible study goes way beyond that. And
Right.
and if you do that, in my opinion, for me, my experience has been that the more I know about the Bible and its history, and it teaches me more about who God is, which simultaneously teaches more about who I am in the story, I am even more sure of my faith than ever before. And I don't need necessarily those power verses to pick me up all the time, because I'm kind of like resting easy in the greater picture of the restoration process, which is we're in the midst of. You know what I mean?
You said it, brother.
Yeah. So I don't know.
That's why.
Go ahead.
That's why I like. That's why you can have an argument as to when people say, okay, yes, all these supernatural, quote unquote, weird events within the Bible aren't salvation centric, but I would like to argue that they play a big part as in you staying inside of a church.
Right.
Because if you don't have an understanding for all these greater historical contexts, if you don't have an understanding of who the Watchers were, of that there were giants, and that how all of this plays in today's world, you don't see the bigger picture, and then everything becomes not irrelevant, but like, so for example, you see politics today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Christians say, well, I don't like to talk about politics. I don't see politics. But then you see how these forces that we cannot see are playing in politics. And if you would understand the supernatural aspect of the Bible, you will see how we are being manipulated by, corporations. We're being manipulated by politics. We're being manipulated by religions. All these things are being played because of the supernatural aspect. So my argument is, it's very important, because that determines whether you stay in church and following Jesus or not. Because then, anything comes along and it just sweeps you away.
That's right. That's right. It so sharpens our discernment. And, you're talking about politics, and this is probably a good segue for me to, I've got some new research that I want to share with your audience, with you guys. This is the first time I've ever shared it.
Ooh, nice.
Definitely.
You heard it here first, folks.
About a week ago, I woke up in the middle of the night. It's 3:00 in the morning. Sometimes that's how this stuff happens,
Yes, it does.
I wasn't, I didn't have all my journals open. I didn't have my Sumerian grammar next to me. I didn't have all that laid out. I was in bed. I woke up at 3:00 in the morning, and for some reason I was thinking about a linguistic exercise that I used to do with my World Civ students to illustrate how languages spread, how specifically Indo-European languages. And I would commonly use the word for king. So, for instance, like in Sanskrit, in Hindi, the ancient Indian languages, the word for king was Raja. And by comparison, in Latin, the word for king was rex. And in Linear A Greek, the word was ruja. And even in English, we retain words like regal, that are related to that. So you can kind of see the exercise that I would use you can kind of see the logic behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got what linguists call a shared morpheme or cognate, this idea that's shared between words from what would seem to be disparate languages. Okay, so you're probably okay, whatever. This is probably something that only scholars do. They wake up and think about this stuff in the middle of the night. But I was familiar with the research of people like Mike and Derek Gilbert. We talk to each other quite a bit because we each bring something different to the table. We have different skill sets and training, and we all have different pieces of the puzzle. But I started looking at one word with one of the names for tribes of giants, Rephaim, based on the work of a lot of my peers, and comparison. The Rephaim, of course, were a tribe of giants mentioned in the Old Testament. Og of Bashan is probably the most popular. And that word usually translates as shades or wraiths or dead ones. There's work not only done by people like Heiser and Gilbert, but other academics like Amara News has done some fantastic work on linking some of the other ancient Near Eastern words to Rephaim. For instance, the word shows up in Ugaritic literature and some of their death cults that honored their ancient kings as Rop or Rapi, a king or dead king, a long dead king. And Rabu was the Akkadian word, which is probably a Sumerian borrow word for prince or ruler. Mm-hmm. And so I started thinking, if you boil this down to the morpheme at the beginning, and that that's this component of a word that you can't break down any farther. That being the R followed by whatever vowel it would be, and I don't want to get too obtuse or abstract here, but because I fell asleep in some of my linguistics classes too. So, but if you take that first part, the R, with whatever vowel it would have been followed by, because vowels you could kind of play a little fast and loose with them in ancient Near Eastern languages. They came later. They were basically just pretty much understood. And if anybody has studied Hebrew or anything like that, you probably know a little bit about that. But just suffice to say that vowels came later, and they were just sort of understood. They weren't really written down when they wrote languages down. Same is true for Mesopotamian languages. So I started wondering, the relationship is demonstrated there in the ancient Near Eastern material. Does it extend beyond into the spread of other languages around the world, particularly Indo-European languages? And so I began to look for words for king or ruler that might be similar to this initial morpheme, the RA or RE or RU in some cases. And it was another matrix level deep dive for me, because I found about 80 words, and this is just beginning to scrape the surface. And I'll share some of those with you in a moment. But what's interesting about this is that, we know already that this conglomerate early proto-language that linguists called Proto-Indo-European both impacted and was impacted by ancient Near Eastern languages in their infancy. And the Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European homeland, where these languages began to branch out into Eurasia, was located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And the lower end of this region touched eastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia. Mm. Well, we also know that the Sumerians weren't indigenous, who were the mother culture of Mesopotamia. They weren't indigenous to that part of the world. They came from that region where the Indo-European languages began to sprout from. I thought that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All these similarities can't be an accident, and
Right.
it's interesting too, because of the reverence that these pagan traditions had for their dead, these dead kings. They're talking about their god kings, for all intents and purposes, the first few generations of giants, the people that were actually their first kings, who ruled them autocratically and oppressively. This legacy was continued in early civilization because virtually all of them were theocratic monarchies where their rulers believed they were either gods or they were representatives of gods on the earth. So there's this oppressive, controlling idiom that's associated with this morpheme. And I thought, how far, I began to ask, how far does this go? And I just came up, like I said, with a list of 80 words. The study is only in its initial phases.
Wow.
But for instance, I mentioned Sanskrit and, all of the related languages like Punjabi and the Javanese. And, there's about half a dozen of them that are related to Sanskrit and Hindi that are scattered over South and Southeast Asia, who use Raja or some version of that, Rajan, as the word for king. The Gothic word, this would have been the language that tribes like the Alans and the Sarmatians and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths spoke. The word is rakes. In Hittite, they often borrow words from Mesopotamian languages, and so you often see Rabbah as the name for king or ruler.
Mm-hmm.
In Azerbaijani, you have Kral. In Bengal, you have again Raja. In Basque, you have Erega. In Catalan, you have Ray. In ancient Irish, ancient Gaelic, the word for king is Ri. In Croatian, Kralj, Czech, Kral. In French, we're getting into the Romance languages that are descendants of Latin. You have words like Roy. In Spanish, the word for king is Rey. As I said, English also borrows some of these cognates in words like regal and royal. I'm just sort of randomly going through the list here, but you sort of get the idea.
Yeah, no.
In Malay, Raja, Polish, Krol, Romanian, Rege, Russian, Kroi. The list just goes on and on and on and on. And like I say, I'm just scratching the surface here.
Now, do you think I'm wondering? Do you think? I remember reading this a while ago that the ancient, what we'd consider maybe the ancient Israelite, or maybe not even before then, was it God's intention not to have, in your opinion, from what you can tell, not to have like written language? Because I remember like reading or hearing something about how even the written language stuff that came from like the Watchers kind of thing, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I never looked into that, and I can definitely see the damage that can come out of being able to write, because now you can duplicate lies.
Reality.
Yeah, you can manipulate reality, but I just never looked into it. Is there stories like that in ancient Mesopotamia, or with all of that stuff, with the fallen Watchers?
I'll give some commentary on that. First, I personally don't believe that all of those kinds of like skills like astronomy or mathematics or the sciences, or even writing, in and of themselves are are necessarily evil. They can be used for evil, and
Right.
that's the modus operandi of the Watchers, and the demonic realm in general is to corrupt and misuse and appropriate and make facsimiles and terrible parodies, if you will, of these basic components of knowledge. Even the concept of, I'm talking about the concept of king being tied to, the Rephaim, the Rop or Rabu. That's an example of taking, God as sovereign king, taking that concept and polluting it so that, built into this word is a set of characteristics associated with these god kings that corrupted humanity. And on an ideological, idiomatic level, perhaps even at a subconscious level, because words are ideas, words are culture.
Right.
We've retained this idea until fairly recently. This idea about because of the way historically these words have been passed along and diffused and developed, they've retained that morpheme of R followed by whatever vowel,
right?
Whether it's A, E, and because of they've retained that, they retain these these basic characteristics of these oppressive god kings that oppressed and usurped humanity.
I see.
So, as to I joked at the beginning of the program that timing is everything. I don't think when the Watchers did what they did, it's not that anything slips past God, but the timing was such that humanity wasn't ready necessarily for it, if that makes any sense.
No, yeah. And that's kind of the one thing
each of these components of knowledge, were co-opted and misused. Even Azazel, to bring it back full circle, he is ascribed all sin. He reveals the mysteries of heaven, the secrets of heaven, is what Enoch says. So can you imagine what that could have been? Right.
Yeah, no, that's hard to imagine, but I always like to say and tell people, like, a sin, like, all of this can be used to sin, and how, it's like you said, it's how you use it. I've always told people that that's exactly what sin is. It's just a corruption of what God designed it to be. You know what I mean? And it could be writing. It could be like, for example, the reason I got this idea is because we spoke to a fellow friend of ours. His name is Mike Davis, and he talks about emotional intelligence, And one of the reasons that kind of made me think about this was he talks about how, because if you ask, he talks about emotions, and he's like, if is hate bad, and you're, our instant kind of knee-jerk reaction is like, yeah, hate's not good, and then he's like, well, is love good? And it's like, yeah, of course love is good, but then he takes it back to the Bible, and he goes, what about when he is rebuking his people for saying, for doing this, you love what is evil, right? And so other people, you hate what is good, you hate what is evil. So it's how you use the emotion, in what direction that it's pointing, that it makes it either right or wrong, because even our emotions were designed by God for a specific use.
Yeah, and I think C.S. Lewis, in his book *The Four Loves*, does a really good job of illustrating that. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he says, we need to remember that God is love, but not make love our God.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that's why I say,
especially
it's kind of
when now these days.
Generation.
Oh yeah, for sure,
yeah,
exactly.
Jesus, the life coach,
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Not only that, but like love all. Love kind of has this whole subjective meaning.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's very dangerous.
No,
well, and a lot of that has to do with the jettisoning of objective truth and how postmodernism is.
Yeah, we talked about that. Me and Omar did a show on that because we discovered Jordan Peterson, and we like his work when he talks about these things, the postmodern kind of, and we did a little episode kind of discussing that idea and how it's just led to so much trouble making things subjective and not objective, and how truth is objective no matter what, and that whole thing. So
and I think that plays also into the whole discussion of the biblical context. Mm-hmm. That within our modern day, it's just a lot of things become just so subjective, and it's because we're not taking it within its context. We're not taking it within how the author meant for us to take it, And there's some of the things we're just taking so like allegorically, or we're just taking it as a mythology, and there's just
very liberal interpretation.
Yeah, very liberal interpretation.
Well, I mean, we can say, quite frankly, it doesn't matter if you believe in it or not, because it's factual. It is what it is. It's the truth.
Yeah,
the truth that, John Adams said, facts are stubborn things, and they are,
They're stubborn things. I like that.
And you said you're also working on or you just finished a book. I was listening to your YouTube channel yesterday, and you said that you just finished a book on the Founding Fathers.
Yeah, I've kind of been sitting on it a little bit. Like I said, I've taught American history for about 20 years, and there are just some observations that I gathered about the Founding Fathers, just kind of some historical meditations, and I thought that it would be good, particularly, on Inauguration Day, as we're making this for people to reflect on those kinds of things, considering the perhaps, precipitous might be the best word to describe our republic these days.
Tentative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we know you're gonna. We know we don't have much time left with you, but do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. I look at the traditional 7 founding fathers, and that of course be George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, John Jay, and who am I missing? I feel like I'm listing members of the Justice League here.
Oh, pretty much.
It's not Hancock, is it? John Hancock?
No, it's Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
Yeah, and I probably you mentioned Chris Pinto, and I have some disagreements with some of his conclusions.
We do too.
But what I'm saying is, clearly, I do bring up the Illuminati in this work, and I think that may be one of the more interesting currents running through the story of the American Revolution, namely because of what's happening in Europe at the time. If there are people that are familiar with the French Revolution, they may be superficially familiar with how the Jacobins and some of the more extreme elements in the French Revolution were instrumental in fomenting that. Mm-hmm. And those Jacobins were largely controlled by the Bavarian Illuminati. There's a very interesting, and this is kind of the George Washington that most people will not see in their college classes or what have you. But there's a very interesting series of correspondences between him and a minister, and the minister is writing him about Weishaupt and his literature, and he says, look, you need to read this book, and I think the Illuminati are here. Well, Washington, this is after his presidency. This is like 1798. Well, Washington launches back at him and says, yeah, I know that they're already here, and he references the Illuminati and the Jacobins infiltrating the Freemasonic lodges that existed in America at that time, largely because of all the recruiting that the French tried to do for the revolution in the early republic. It was one of the things that irritated the founding fathers. And, whereas an argument could be made for people like Franklin and Adams, and maybe even to an extent Jefferson, most people who really hone in on the conspiracy element of stories of like Washington say that he was a master mason. Well, that's really only 3 degrees in. And what time did when you really begin to dig into the documents and look at Washington's life, what time did the guy have to orchestrate this conspiracy? He was busy out in the field. He was a fighting general. This guy was busy out in the field during the Revolution. Again, I don't deify any of our founding fathers. These people. I think that's one of the big mistakes is to lift these figures, up into some sort of apotheosis where they become the American pantheon. I don't think there's any value in that at all. And I also don't think that there's any value in saying that, everybody that was involved, whether ideologically or militarily or politically, in the founding of our country was involved in some Illuminati conspiracy. That's not how they work. Mm-hmm. They work in the shadows. They infiltrate. They don't take over entire institutions. Mm. And I would challenge people, if they do think that they operate that way, well, then you need to follow document trails. They don't own the Smithsonian. That's not to say that there aren't, bad
oh yeah, I have heard that.
Yeah, they're the giant bones. They're hidden.
They're hidden.
Right.
Right.
I'm not saying that there aren't. Illuminati plants in places like the Smithsonian, but you could make that argument also for all of our institutions of government, our economic system. Clearly, that's going on. But as for I can speak. I use the Smithsonian because, I've done museum work. There are good people and good scholars that are doing good work in the Smithsonian, but that's not to say that there aren't people who have nefarious aims who are part of this larger cabal. And by the same logic, there were people who were trying to undermine and control the American Revolution, and they were part of this Jacobin arm of the Bavarian Illuminati. Washington clearly knew about them. Washington was a sharp guy. He was also, you could also look at Washington as really the founder of American spycraft. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a whole lot that got past this guy. But, quite frankly, Washington was too busy. Even if he was nominally involved, and again, this is obviously not an endorsement of Freemasonry. There's a lot of Luciferian stuff going on there. But, the guy just didn't have the time to devote to it, quite frankly.
Right. It's kind of rough because these days, the kind of proof that I don't like now is when as of late, if you find a picture of somebody with some other person and it's kind of like, oh, that's proof. That's it. Proof in the pudding. He's as evil as the other guy, and I personally don't like that. Like a lot of truthers like to do that, because if you were to do that to me, for example, I just found out one of the owners of the martial arts studio. I go do martial arts, and one of the owners of one of the many martial arts studios, he is the manager of a Masonic temple. You know, like he's like I don't know what level Mason or whatever. And I've taken pictures with a guy. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, you know, we've been accused once already of being like Luciferian or this and that or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you too. There you go. So all they need to do is find that picture and then follow that guy's Facebook. And it's like, oh, there it is. Chuck is part of the whole thing. And I'm like, no, I'm not, man. Like, I don't know what that guy's doing until I found out. And then And I just don't like that. But like you said, the reason I mentioned that is because, there seems to be a lot of actual historical proof for the meddling of these secret societies a lot in the background working,
Clearly. I mean, the document trail is there, and you can give them whatever appellation you want to, but there was clearly, and I would argue still is, an orchestrated effort, to undermine stability.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say the objective of your new book is exactly, talking about all these situations in there?
The Founding Fathers book?
Yeah.
It's mainly, I just want to get, first of all, I want people to be thinking about these things just because it's important to us culturally. But I think it's timely, too, to do some reflection, again, considering the state of our republic today. And I chose the Founding Fathers in the early Republic era because, people think that the future of America is precipitous right now. Listen, it was precipitous in the early Republic.
Mm-hmm.
There was no guarantee that once the revolution was done, that we were even going to have an America. Our currency was worthless.
Mm.
All the individual states had debts. The fledgling federal government had debts to France, to Spain, to the Dutch. So we were on pretty shaky ground. Plus, you add into that Spain was getting real antsy now that we were on their shores on the Mississippi. Britain still wanted the colonies back. So we were on pretty shaky ground, even at that time. And so I just want to get people to reflect. And I also try to put some things in there for people to think about, like this, Washington essentially warning, the country about the Illuminati. He even makes reference to this, I think, in his farewell address, about a year and a half before he has this correspondence. He doesn't use the word Illuminati in his farewell address, but I think he does use the word Jacobin. But anyway, it's very clear that this is part of his discourse, with the public.
You think maybe there's I don't know, it just reminded me of something. Do you think maybe it reminds me of Trump exposing the deep state? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
When you said that, you know what I'm saying? He just kind of puts them on blast. And I mean, if our listeners know here on the show, Omar's, he's firm Trump supporter. I'm just in the middle. I'm like, look, I'm just trying to. I think being conservative is just naturally makes more sense. You know what I mean? And so to me,
right.
And so I would always identify myself as a conservative, not necessarily a Republican or Democrat or nothing like that. But
right.
Speaking of which, and this is just like last and final thought. Just because I want to get it from someone who, knows the Bible better than me, because I say this and it irritates me every time things go really wrong here in America. And then I hear a lot of believers say these things. So for me personally, it kind of ties in with eschatology. Every time, America's about to lose and it's going to turn socialist or communist, or things are really going to hit the fan now. I hear it. It rises in every church that I go to. Oh, Jesus is coming back for sure now. Like this is the return of Jesus. And, I personally don't stand on the pre-trib rapture or none of that pre-trib rapture kind of theology. That's not where I stand. So to me, I guess it doesn't make a lot of sense to say now that this is happening to America, that eschatologies revolve around what happens to America, you know? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I just want to hear from you. It doesn't matter if you're against my idea, but I'm just throwing it out there just because I personally, it's like my soapbox where I'm like, no, just relax, folks. Who knows when he returns? I don't know, but it doesn't have to do with, in my opinion, so much to do with the fall of American democracy, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm not a date setter. I never have been. It's kind of dangerous territory to get into. At the same time, we could sort of look at, you know, it's always a good idea to look at the signs of the times, you know, because that was one of the things that Jesus lambasted the Pharisees about is, you know, you guys can predict when it's going to rain, but you can't, you know, you don't know what's going on, you know, around you immediately on the ground kind of thing. And, you know, there have been horrific periods in not just our history, but in world history, you know, where people thought that it was, you know, the end of the world was just around the corner. I mean, look at the 14th century. People thought that the four horsemen were rampant. You had, you know, famines and the Black Death, you know, the bubonic plague, and all of these little wars, you know, for, you know, to fight for nationalities. You know, people literally, even the art of the period reflects it. You know, there's all this Grim Reaper, you know, skeletons riding horses. You know, people literally thought that it was the end of the world. It wasn't. You know, World War I was the most horrific thing anybody had ever seen. And now, you know, at that point, film, you know, was in its infancy, and we were getting it, you know, almost in real time. You know, people were getting these gory images of war that they had never seen, you know, on film reels and things like that. But you have to, you know, you do have to weigh our times with things like culture and technology and how all of this could sort of juxtapose and perhaps be heralding, you know, that we're closer to the end than we've ever been. I do think the prophetic clock is sort of ticking. 1947 was a big year. You know, you've got the establishment of Israel as a nation. You've got the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've also got weird things like the Roswell incident and the Babylon workings taking place that Jack Parsons is doing.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, again, I'm not a date setter. I do think that the prophetic clock is ticking, but, you know, it's hard to gauge still, you know, and I'm certainly not going to sit on my hands and not do what we're called to do, you know, which is first and foremost a Great Commission,
right?
But also my calling as a scholar and a man of faith,
right?
Now, as to, you know, whether America sinks or swims, so goes the world. Maybe, maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I like to say
These
is
are trying times.
They are very trying, but what I like to say is even if we do turn communist and we turn Venezuela, we turn Russia, whatever, you know, even if we turn into that, you still have work to do for the kingdom. You know what I mean? Like it does not matter, you know?
Our mission has not changed.
Exactly. So I tend to be a little hesitant just because before me and Omar were both kind of in the pre-trib camp, and maybe this is not that eschatology's what are my words? Maybe it wasn't the intention of that specific view of eschatology to make us the way, at least I turned, which was kind of I don't know, like I call it like a Christian nihilism. Because we're like, well, there's nothing we could do about the evil because the Bible says everything's gonna go super evil, and that just proves that Jesus is coming back. So there's nothing you can do. It's all gonna burn, baby. So what can you do? You know what I mean? And it made me not really have difficult conversations, political conversations with people. It made me kind of skip a lot of things just because I kind of had that in the back of my head where I was like, well, doesn't really matter. Jesus coming back anyways. You know what I mean? And I know that not everyone that has that view thinks or feels that way, but that's kind of where I was. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it can make you complacent, in a way. But a certain amount of eschatological awareness is sort of built into our faith. Just the phraseology that Jesus uses. He's always talking about kingdom of heaven is at hand. There's a sense of urgency in that anyway. And so we're never to take our hand off the plow and not do the work, of our faith, not hold to the disciplines of our faith. But at the same time, you can't wait around for the sky to fall on you.
Right.
Yeah.
You gotta.
But
I'm sorry.
Maybe that's a West Texas folksy way to look at it, but like I say, even if our political circumstances change, our mission as Christians doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to ask, Omar?
No. I was just agreeing.
Yeah.
Agreeing and saying that, that it doesn't change. It all remains the same. Like the world can change and everything can be different. Not a lot of Christians are fortunate enough to
be
live
in America.
In the United States,
right?
Be in America, and they're in China, and their mission is the same.
Right, and what an opportunity! Again, what an opportunity we have to say that, hey, look, you're wondering about the source of these political changes. It's less a political problem and more a supernatural problem. And hey, look, we have all this intel on what's going on. So, what an opportunity we have. And, we're potentially poised for, another great awakening. I think that's exciting personally.
Oh yeah.
Me too. I think a lot of people have been, due to the political climate and everything that has been going on, a lot of people have been understanding that, hey, there are spiritual forces at work and there's evil and there is good. A lot of people who were just sleeping in the church are now starting to realize, hey, there's a lot of bad stuff, a lot of bad people in government, a lot of bad people in my local government.
Yeah.
And we need to do something about it. We need to pray,
Yeah.
Right.
That's what we said it kind of in one of our last episodes is, at the very least we can affect our school boards, our local governments and do things that affect Christians in our local areas, So, but any last words, Judd, that you wanted to get in there before we land this plane? And where can folks find any of your stuff if they want to get a hold of you and ask you? Because like I said, and you talk a lot of cool stuff like the mythology, like the vampires, like the werewolves. There's so much. I mean, really, we just kind of touched the surface of a bunch of little things, and I remember you even mentioning the werewolves and vampires, linking back to the pre-flood or the Noah's flood, and I'm sure people would be like, "What? Yeah. That's a biblical thing? You can connect that to biblical thing?" People probably wouldn't connect these kinds of things to the flood, but I mean, if people are interested in those kinds of things, where can they find it?
Sure. Well, people can go to burtonbeyond.com. They can also go to the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, which is TIOBA.org. I've got several books on giants, I have sales almost every week, so people can save a little dough. I teach classes we're talking about context and ancient context and linguistic context. I teach classes on biblical anthropology, and this for the rest of this month, I'm offering my entire 12-class module certification for $150. It's usually $200. So money's a little tight. I knocked off $50. And I've got a couple of ebooks that the Founding Fathers ebook I'm going to drop. And if people are interested in this new linguistic analysis that I'm doing on a Rephaim, I'm also going to be putting that report out and available. It'll probably be available for about $5 within the next 24 hours. And I'll put a link. I'll put links on my website if people want to do this. But people can follow me on Twitter. I put content on my YouTube channel. It's at Burton Beyond. So a lot of ways people can follow me. Facebook.
Nice. I'll definitely put links to all that stuff on the show notes so people can just click away.
Sure. Appreciate it.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, hang with us, Judd. The folks are going to listen to some cool tunes, and me and you are going to talk a little bit behind the scenes. So stick with us, folks. We'll be right back.